Hey guys, welcome back. So with us recently talking King in Black and also getting into King in Black symbiote Spider-Man, I also thought that it'd be really interesting if we hopped into Black Knight and talk about some of his recent discoveries like throughout the modern day portion of the event. And with the way that it's done, which very much dips into like retcon territory, but with the way that Simon Spurrier carries us through, this new information seems to make a bit more sense than some of the original history of things like the Black Knight and the Ebony Blade. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping in, much like a number of the other King in Black tie-ins, this takes us to another narrative that's happening alongside with the main event. And when we jump in, Dane Whitman is visited by one of his ancestors, Sir Percival of Scandia, who's the 6th century ancestor of Dane Whitman, who had became the first Black Knight. And in the case of the Black Knight, at times you have these situations to where Dane will either go back in time and use the body of one of his ancestors, or you have situations like this here, where Sir Percival will appear to him in present day and bring to Dane's attention that he's needed somewhere. But in this case, when Percival pops up, he catches Dane like in the mode of nearly going mad. And when we jumped in, like he done slashed up his Avengers mural, which was pretty nice by the way. I kind of want one like that, just with me at the center. But in the case of Dane, these are kind of byproducts of being the Black Knight. And it's pretty clear that he feels some type of way about no longer being an Avenger. But then on top of that, he's still subject to the curse of the Ebony Blade, which drives the wielder mad, causes them to crave blood, and according to Merlin, it's one of those things to where once the user spills blood, then that craving and the madness is just amped up even more. But with the Ebony Blade, much like now, there have been times where we've seen the wielder exhibit the traits of this madness without necessarily going on a killing spree. But we'll get into more of that in a little bit. But for now, like with Sir Percival telling Dane that he needs to go out and assist the other adjacent Avengers who Tony Stark has commissioned, at first Dane kind of goes into the well, I deserve better kind of thing, or better yet, I'm above the adjacent Avenger type of work. But then when Percival tells him like, look to the heavens, fool, it's dragons, then immediately Dane just jumps on it because he's like, man, why didn't you start with that? And it's here where Dane jumps in towards the beginning of the present day events of King in Black to where he encounters Knull's symbiote dragons like just before the sky closes up. But then it's here where he's fighting this dragon to where he starts to remember the events from King in Black symbiote Spider-Man. And he picks this up from not only like the black goo of a symbiote to where like he touches it and he's like, ooh, familiar texture, this is imported. But it's like first he recognizes that this is a symbiote, but then also with fighting it, he notices the similar reaction that the symbiote has with its vulnerability to the Ebony Blade. But then on top of that, it's also here where he digs into this dragon to where he then feels something that's controlling this dragon then reach into his mind. And when it does, he screams out, no. And immediately we see Knull going through Dane Whitman's mind and just looking through the history and the known legacy of the Black Knight to where Merlin would choose someone who is pure of heart, who could resist the temptations of the bloodthirst and the madness, which for many years is what would consider someone to be worthy to wield the Ebony Blade, which was forged from a Star Stone with the use of much magic, which Merlin would describe as a byproduct or side effect of his power. But also like with looking back through this history, what I think is interesting is like just the way that Merlin is also expressed to be half demon, which is a detail that's not brought up too often. And I mean, I get it, why, it's kind of weird with his mother being virgin, possessed by a demon, but just to see Knull notice this, as Dane also sees what Knull's seeing, and it more or less foreshadows in a way some of the things that are at the forefront of Knull's attention in relation to Dane Whitman and the Ebony Blade. And it's here where Dane realizes that not only does Knull want the Ebony Blade, but also the Ebony Blade wants to be found. But at this point with Dane effectively killing this dragon, it then starts to break apart, sending him falling, causing him to lose the Ebony Blade. But then also as coincidence, this also takes place at the moment where Knull had closed the sky. But on his way falling back through the atmosphere, it's here where he's caught by Aero and he finds himself in Shanghai. And when she catches Dane, she immediately knows who he is. And I feel like most people with the general knowledge of the Avengers will recognize Black Knight. I mean, I could be wrong, but here Dane, he's pretty surprised that she knows who he is, and she's like, of course, you're that guy who got fired from the Avengers because he was real murdery. And immediately Dane's kind of like, well, whoa there, like you don't know the whole story. But she did read it on a Reddit thread, so it had to be true. But even still, like off of that description, like as short as it is, like she's not wrong. But of course Dane feels some type of way with the super brief description of why he's no longer an Avenger. But then it's also here in Shanghai where we see all the Knull dragons. They're causing pandemonium here as well, and Aero lets Dane know that she's one of the heroes who's been called in by Tony Stark, who's been listed as Avengers adjacent. And then on top of this, soon after, you get the arrival of Lin Lai, who's also known as the Swordmaster. But for just a bit of quick history on the Swordmaster, like Lin Lai, he wields a sword called the Sword of Fu Si, which was given to him by his father, who was an archaeologist, who had disappeared shortly after giving Lin this sword. And in the case of Lin, who's a fairly new character in Marvel Comics, because I think he showed up around like 2018, but in his case he's still kind of learning what the sword is capable of, and even up to this point he hasn't been able to use it up to its full potential and power. But from what he is aware of, the sword is heavily sought after by Shi Yao, the god of war, but it's a weapon crafted to be used by someone with a noble spirit. But for Lin, he's highly motivated to figure out more about this sword, which has been giving him these crazy nightmares, but Lin is mainly intrigued because this is really the only connection he has as far as figuring out a way to find his father. But with Lin arriving here, like he initially had thought that this Knull invasion was something that was actually being done by Shi Yao as an effort for him to take the sword of Fu Si. But when he gets here, Aero quickly corrects him and tells him what's actually going on, pertaining to the information that she had got from Tony Stark. But also, like, the whole time that they're having this conversation, like in Mandarin, like Dane Whitman, he's like, okay, you guys are talking about me, ain't you? And I mean, like, initially they're not, but then when Dane holds his hand out and tries to call back the Ebony Blade, like, that's when they start talking about him. Like, look at this guy, he's nuts. Like, no wonder the Avengers let him go. But in the case of Lin, like, he then tells Aero, like, well, since this isn't connected to Shi Yao, then I guess there's really no need for me to be out here. And he more or less tells Aero, like, yeah, you got this, right? But then she more or less responds to him in the matter of, well, if there's anything you can do to help someone, then you just should. Like, that's kind of how the whole hero thing works. But in the middle of this conversation, while Dane is over there, like, trying to see if he's still worthy or whatever, but while he's holding his hand out calling for the Ebony Blade, the Sword of Fu Si then comes to him. And when this happens, Lin's kind of like, well, okay, like, yeah, that's cute and everything, but give it back. But Dane more or less is like, fall back, don't be mad because your sword is choosing. But with even Dane trying to give the sword back, but in this moment, for whatever reason, the sword won't leave him. But also when this happens, Aero tells Lin that it's likely that the sword disagrees with his idea of what a noble spirit is, which is why in this moment it chose Dane Whitman. But at this time, Dane, he also lets them know that he has a general idea of where the Ebony Blade is, and in order for them to stop Knull, they have got to get the sword back in the hands of the Black Knight. And as they make their way to it, like Dane, he's narrating out loud again, calling Aero the Wicked Witch of the East. And when he does, she hears him and she calls him out on it. But then also you have Lin who's following behind, and with doing so, like, he is refusing to brush over the fact that the Black Knight straight stole his sword. But even with this happening and Lin getting a hard time on whether he's being noble or not, there is a moment where he sees one of Knull's dragons about to attack this old lady, and he runs to go cover and protect her with no sword, no power, nothing. And when it happens, it just reminds us that Lin, he's not like completely self-absorbed, and he does care about the well-being of others, but even still, sometimes the heroic inexperience shows. But when this happens in the Black Knight, he notices the magic from the sword when he strikes the dragon and keeps it from eating Lin and the old lady. He then goes back to the dragon and just starts tearing it to pieces. And when he does, like, both Lin and Aero, they're calling him like, hey man, like, calm down. But this dude is clearly like in his zone here, almost like he can't even hear them. And it isn't too long before he realizes that he's just been beating a dead dragon, which at this point makes it seem like that Reddit thread about him was very accurate. But also, like, with Dane kind of blacking out and just going in on this dragon, the sword starts to shake, and Aero lets him know, like, she thinks the sword's about to unchoose him. But then right after this, when Dane strikes it into the ground, and I guess more or less to keep it still, it then stabs into a piece of the symbiote which he's just struck down. And when this happens, Lin also tries to take it back, but then also Knull reaches through from the other end. And here is where it gets pretty interesting, because it's here where Knull recognizes that Dane has brought to his attention another star-forged sword. And much like Knull had seen the history of the Ebony Blade, Knull sees a glimpse through the history of the Sword of Fu Si, and it shows him like Shumagora, Khonshu, Sidorak, until finally it ends with Shi Yao, who Knull addresses as an Elder Shadow dressed in local legends. And when this happens, it's kind of tough to say whether Knull recognizes Shi Yao, but just in this moment, Shi Yao's appearance looks different. But when Knull more or less sees Shi Yao, he's like, I like that look, I'm taking it. But then it's also here where Knull tells Dane more about the Ebony Blade, and Knull lets him know like the history that Dane was led to believe from Merlin as far as the Ebony Blade needing someone who's pure of heart, who could resist the temptations of the bloodlust. Like, this was all a lie. And instead Knull tells him like the Ebony Blade, it feeds off of the darkness in someone's heart, which makes a lot more sense. And to go even further, like Knull makes it make more sense, because he's like, you think that Merlin couldn't find somebody pure of heart in Camelot? Like, pure hearts was running left and right, bruh. But with this happening, Knull just lets him know like the mightiest potential of the Ebony Blade, that it functions in a symbiosis of sorts with those who are impure in heart, and with doing so at its full potential, or symbiosis if you will, that in the right hands it could then become an instrument for the Berserker in black, which doesn't necessarily sound like a segue to a happy ending. But of course Dane, he tells Knull no, and he won't let him have the sword, and that he doesn't believe the things that Knull has said. But Knull just lets Dane know that Dane realizes how impure of heart that he is, which in this case is the true integrity the sword's looking for, which immediately just lets Dane know that everything that Knull had said, it just made too much sense in order for it to be some fabricated lie. And on top of that, the Sword of Fu Si, it then returns back to Lin, leaving Dane, and with doing that, it then kind of puts an exclamation point on top of everything that Knull said. But also when this happens, Aero, she calls their attention because a number of Knull's dragons, they formed together while Dane had experienced this encounter, and with them forming together, they physically combine in the form of Shi Yao. And when this happens, like initially Aero, she believes that it is Shi Yao, but quickly Lin tells her that like nah, it's just Knull, and he just took on the appearance of Shi Yao just to scare people. But when this happens, like for Dane at his lowest point, this is when the Ebony Blade finally returns to him. But when this happens, he's still losing it off of everything that Knull showed him, which at this point really just leaves Aero and Lin to handle this by themselves. And of course, like when this happens, like the two of them, they peep Dane kind of bugging out. And because of that, they then go for Knull, because if they don't, Knull's pretty much just gonna take both of these swords. And they realize that Dane has to more or less figure out this new information that he's gotta process. And essentially he does, because with him realizing that the Ebony Blade is reaching for the impure of heart, which is also something that he feels like he's always known. But with him coming to grips with this and better understanding how this dark magic can be wielded for good, it's in that moment where he then realizes that unlike what Merlin had led him to believe, that wielding this power is not so much about putting away that darkness or denying yourself this bloodlust and these dark desires, but rather accepting who you are while leading into that darkness, which then strengthens the magic of the Ebony Blade, which then allows it to tap into the raw power of the Starstone, which it was crafted from. And when doing this, Dane, he's able to then defeat Knull's symbiote construct. And when he does, initially like Aero and Lin, they think that Knull is defeated altogether. But Dane lets them know that that's not the case, that this was just more of an avatar, and that the true fight isn't over. But even with this, like not long after, Aero mentions like she got a message from Tony Stark, which let her know that she needs to head to New York, and with hearing this, Dane and Lin go with her. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all your support, and for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can go to patreon.com/Dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and let me know how you feel about the update to the Ebony Blade, which I kind of feel like is along the lines of what Malekith was hinting towards during War of Realms, but I'm curious to know what you guys think. So let me know down in the comments or over on Discord, either way, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.